I want to share with you a little bit of a journey that I've been on, and I know you're receiving a copy of a book that I'm going to be talking with you about. I want to tell you some of the journey that led me to write that. You know, my whole life has been spent trying to encourage God's people to grow. That's what my dad did. That's what my dad's done his whole life. He just encouraged God's people to go deeper with God, to experience more of God. Not just to know about God, but to experience God. And so I've watched my dad teach that all of his life, and that's just been the calling God has given me as well. So I'm always trying to help people to grow. And by the way, let me also just say that while I'm here too, if God speaks to you, or maybe through something that I say that when I'm sharing, and you'd like to catch me at some point, or say, can we have breakfast together or something? Let me know. If you'd like to talk to me, just come grab me, and we can make a time to do that. Sometimes people are too shy to do that until I'm on my way out to catch a flight, and then they say, could I just talk to you for a moment? And so I always tell people early on, if you like to, just talk to me. We'll work it out. I'd be happy to spend time with you if you'd like to do that. So I'm always trying to invest in people, and I'm fascinated by growth. And I'll just tell you this. I've been a Christian now a long time myself. I grew up in a Baptist preacher's home. I became a Christian when I was 7. So I've been a Christian a long time now. And I wish I could tell you that every day I just grew another step, every day just another step forward in Christ likeness. Every day just going deeper with God. And day by day just going deeper and deeper and deeper. But the truth is that there are lots of days where I don't think I'm any more of a Christian than I was the day before. I don't think my walk with God's any deeper, my faith's any stronger. I don't think my prayer life is any more powerful. In fact, I think there have been weeks, maybe months, maybe even years, where it wasn't that I wasn't serving God, it's just that I wasn't serving Him any more effectively, any more powerfully, any more faithfully than I had been for years. I know people, in the Christian life, we sort of measure people's walk with God by how many years they put in. Someone says, I've been pastoring this church for 30 years. Or I have guys all the time come and say, Rich, I've been preaching for 30 years now. Well, that's great. But if you've been preaching the same way, with the same power for 30 years, it's not so great. When someone comes and says, I've been a Christian for 50 years. Of course, we all say, well, praise God. But if that person's been a self-centered, faithless, critical, backbiting Christian for 40 years, it's not so good. So just how long you've been doing something doesn't really mean a whole lot, right? What matters is, are you doing it the same way? Are you preaching the same way today that you were 5 years ago? When you pray, are you praying that if I had a tape recording of you praying to God in a quiet time 10 years ago, would it sound any different than the way you pray today? I mean, you had 10 more years to know God. 10 more years of walking with Him, seeing Him answer your prayers, speak to you in His Word. Surely that has had an effect on you. You're doing something differently. Well, I say all that to say that when I look at my own personal growth in Christ, it's gone in spurts. Like there may be days and months where I'm basically the same Christian, just doing the best I can. And then all of a sudden, God gets a hold of me. Sometimes it's through something difficult, like a crisis, but He gets my attention. Other times it's through maybe it's a sermon, it's a conference like this. And I come not even knowing why I'm even here. And then God just, first service, God just sort of awakens me and stirs something in my spirit, and I just take off. And for the next maybe couple of years, I'm just going down the straightaway. But then eventually things slow down. And God has to get my attention another way. I could probably identify about 6 different key times in my life where most of my growth took place in just a race. Suddenly, I'm on fire. God, I'm all in. I'm all sold out. Just help me become all that you want me to be. And I just take off for a while. God just does great things. But inevitably, things kind of slow down. You sort of get into a rhythm, and before you know it, you're kind of just doing it the same. Well, probably the last time that God really got my attention was about 3 years ago. And 3 years ago, I had one of those life-changing moments that just really shook me to the core. And it was actually a good thing. 3 years ago, I actually became a grandparent. Now, I'd heard that being a grandparent was a good thing. Now, many of you here are far too young to be thinking about that, but that's what I thought until 3 years ago, that I was too young to be thinking about those things. But for me, it was pretty dramatic, because one day I wasn't a grandparent, and 15 days later I had 3 grandsons, just 0 to 3 in 15 days. I just believe go big or go home. And so it's like, all right, let's do this. And they all lived right around me, we all went to the same church. And you know, I'd heard people say it was good, and I assumed it must be, because people all spoke so highly of it. But like, I've done lots of things in my life, and I just figured it would just be another one of many good things that have been happening in my life. And you know, I'd never get crazy about it. You know, I wouldn't be like those obnoxious grandparents you sit next to on airplanes, and they work in conversations about their grandchildren in every conversation they have with total strangers. And then they pull out 38 pictures of their grandson's 6-year-old birthday party, you know, and they bore you to tears. Like, I just vowed I would never become that person. But then one day, I get this call. It's Saturday morning, and a lot of weekends I wake up Saturday morning on the road somewhere, but this Saturday morning I was actually home, and I planned to get a bunch of stuff done. It's just, for me, delightful when you travel all the time to actually have a weekend at home. And so here it is, a lazy Saturday morning, and all of a sudden the phone rings, and it's my second son, Daniel, and he said, "Dad, the twins are on the way." Twin grandson. Today I will not just be a grandfather, I'll be a grandfather of 2 right off the bat. And I'm a relatively intelligent person, but in that one phone call, I suddenly became an idiot. I mean, I don't know what happened to me. It's like my brain cells just fried in that phone call. I just turned to my wife and said, "Lisa, the twins, they're on the way. We've got to get to the hospital." And so we just dropped everything. We literally just ran into the garage, got in the car, and I realized I don't have my keys. Stay right here. I ran back in the house, got my keys, came back, got in the car. I don't have my wallet. Just wait right here. And it took me 3 trips just to get my car out of the driveway. And then we start racing off down to the hospital. I look and I realize the car is completely empty of gas. There's just no way we'll ever get to the gas station or to the hospital. I said, "Lisa, don't get upset, but we're going to have to stop for gas. We'll never make it." She said, "Well, why did you let it get this low? You knew we were going to get this call. You should have filled it up ahead of time." I said, "Lisa, these babies are coming 2 weeks early. Today is ahead of time. This is the day. This is the day I was going to do it. My first Saturday at home. 2 weeks ahead of time." But they came ahead of time. And so I'll just get just $5 worth, just enough to just get us to the hospital. Race in there. I literally pulled into the first gas station. I jump out of the car, race to the nozzle, and the nozzle actually has one of those covers over it because there's no gas in that particular tank. I've got to get back in the car, race up to the next tank, get out, get gas in there, race out of there, and now I'm sort of putting my life in my own hands. But I said, "Lisa, don't get upset at this, but we left so quickly, I didn't even have any coffee yet." And those poor babies, if their first sight of their most favorite human being is me without coffee, it'll terrify those innocent children. They'll climb right back in the womb and say, "We're not going out," if that's what people look like on the outside. And I said, "Can I just there's a McDonald's right there. Can we just stop and get them some coffee, maybe an oatmeal to go? Because this could be a long day. We're not sure when the babies will actually be born. And I won't even stop. We'll go through the drive-thru. I won't even stop at the drive-thru. I'll just drive slowly by and say, 2 coffees and 2 oatmeals to go." And so we swerve in there. I give them my order, and they said, of all things, they said, "Well, sorry, we're going to have you just go over to the pickup area for a moment. We'll bring it out to you in just a moment." And I won't even tell you what my beloved is muttering to me at that point, but we pull over and we're waiting, and didn't even turn off the car. We're just racing, ready to go. As soon as they bring the food out, we're off, and we race along the road. I'd never been to this hospital before, but I assumed I knew where it was, and so we finally see, sure enough, a big H for a hospital up above this complex. I pull in, and Lisa says, don't even park the car. She said, just drop me off at the front door. She said, those children are going to be in kindergarten before I see them at this point. And so I drop her off. She doesn't even look back. She just runs into the hospital. I'm trying to find, where do you park in this place? And I'm trying to just frantically find the first parking place and get into that hospital. And all of a sudden I see Lisa running out of the hospital. She's waving her arms like this. I swerve back around, roll down the window. She says, this is the wrong hospital. Like I've literally gone to the wrong hospital. She jumps in the car. It was an affiliate of the Wright Hospital, but they didn't do babies at this one. And so we have to go 1.5 miles further south. We swerve into that one. This time I'm not going to give her a head start. I realize it's my grandchild too. So I park the car. We both go running in, race up to the second floor. There's a maternity ward. I race up to this nurse at the desk. I said, I'm Richard Blackaby. I'm the grandfather. Where do you need me? Now, I assumed they'd want to get me gloved up and gowned up and in some strategic position, certainly for the birth of 2 adorable grandsons. And they pointed to a little cubbyhole room at the back. They said, we would like you back there. And I discovered, first I said, well, you must not have heard me. I said, I'm the grandfather. That must have some clout around here, doesn't it? They said, yeah, we did hear you. We want you in that little room right over there. And I found out later that there's a much larger waiting area that normal people are put in, but I guess they wanted to quarantine me, so I didn't infect people with whatever it was I had at that point. So I'm in a room, there's no one else in there but me. My wife saw no reason to stay in there when there's a perfectly good gift shop just 1 floor below, so she's off to the gift shop. And so I'm just sitting by myself. There's a TV monitor playing. It's a 24-hour news station. And of course, if you've watched 24-hour news stations, you know what I'm seeing. There's a terrorist who's just blown themselves up at a wedding, killing 24 innocent people. There's been a shooting, there's been a scandal, there's been violence, there's been a racial divide. There's just been one negative story after the next. And after about 30 minutes of watching nothing but one negative, depressing news story after the next, I realized that is the world that my 2 grandsons are entering today. And it was a very sobering moment for me. And on the one hand, I'm so excited, and the next moment I'm thinking, but what on earth are those 2 little boys going to face? Stuff I never dreamed of when I was growing up in my day. Well, finally they announced that one of the grandkids was still getting some servicing done in the nursery, but there was one grandchild now in my daughter-in-law's hospital room and available for handling. And so my wife and I made our way in. And my wife is here this week. You'll get to meet her and know her, but I'm usually very good to my wife. I've got witnesses that will testify to that. But at that point, there was only one grandson, and there were 2 grandparents. And I played a lot of sports, and I know that if you just step in front of the opposing player, you can get to the ball before they do. And so, very sort of discreetly, I just said, "Oh, look at that baby!" I stepped in front of her. She fell into a bedpan or something, and I made just a beeline for that grandchild. Held up my first grandchild. And you all have held babies, you look into a brand new baby, and you just wish you could see into their future. Just know, what will they become? Will they come to put their trust in you? When will they be aware that there's a God in heaven who loves them? Will they grow up to be a godly young man? And you're looking in, but I've just had all of those horrible news stories just filling my mind for the last hour now. And I just realized this beautiful innocent baby, but there'll be a day when pornography will come spewing through the internet waves, trying to destroy this innocent little mind and this pure heart. And there'll be days when this boy will grow up, and he may be in a classroom somewhere, and his professor may actually mock the very thought of there being a God who created this universe. And there may be a day when his own friends laugh at him because of his Christian morals. And they say, nobody does that anymore. And in that moment, as I'm looking at this boy thinking, what all is waiting for this child? What all is this child going to face as he grows up? Trying to be a godly young man. God just said, what kind of grandfather does this little boy need? So that when his professor laughs in the class and says, "There is no God." Well, that same little boy said, "But I've heard my grandfather talk to God. I know there's a God." And when his friends say, why would you live that way? Nobody lives that way anymore. Well, that same grandson say, "But my grandfather's a Christian. And if that's what it means to be a Christian, then that's what I want to be too." What God just quietly said to me is, this boy is going to be facing a lot in the days to come. And he's going to need a godly influence, someone that can be a rock and can show him what a man of God, a person of faith really looks like. And God's a God of truth and grace. And in truth, God said, "You're not yet the man this little boy needs you to be." But then in grace, he said, "But you could be." And there's something that God taught me in that moment that has just stuck with me ever since. And it's simply this. I realized I was not yet the man of God that some of the dearest people in my life needed me to be. And if I was content to stay the same person that I was right now, anytime you say, "Well, that's the way I've always been," anytime you say, "Well, that's how I've done it for the last 10 years," when you stop growing, other people suffer. Other people will suffer because you stop growing. If you're praying today the same way you were 10 years ago, you're not the prayer God wants you to be. If you're preaching the same way you were 10 years ago, your people are missing out on what God could have done if you let Him continue to grow you. And you see, I've always known that if I don't discipline myself, if I don't keep growing, it'll hurt me. But holding that grandchild in my arms that day, I thought to myself, well, if I was the only one to suffer, I would deserve it. But this little baby does not deserve to suffer because his grandfather got lazy. His grandfather became complacent. And so I decided right then, in fact, a lot of times I didn't bring any PowerPoints this time, but oftentimes I subject people to a picture about this time of my grandkids, but I won't be that grandparent to you tonight. But the next chance I had to get home and have a quiet time, the next time I had a chance just to get with God, and I carved out significant time one morning where it wasn't a rushed quiet time. This was like, "God, I want the mother of all quiet times. Let's go. I am ready to become the man of God my grandkids need me to be." So where do you go? If you're going to go to the Bible and you're going to have this quiet time that you know is going to take you to the next level with God, I mean, where would you turn? Like, that's maybe not the time for Leviticus, you know. I mean, there's a time and a place for Leviticus, but maybe not then, you know. Maybe not Job. I didn't want to read about a lot of suffering. Where do you turn that after you read it, you're just fired up to be more the man and woman of God than you've ever been in your life? And so I'm sitting there, I've carved out all morning, here's my Bible, there's just me, my coffee, God. All right, God, where do I turn? And I'm actually kind of flipping through my mind, where should I read? Because I want this to be epic. I want this to just take me to the next place. And ultimately, I think of Elijah. Elijah on Mount Carmel. Like, does it get any more epic? If I'm going to be the man of God that my grandsons need me to be, it doesn't get better than Elijah on Mount Carmel. There he is, a whole nation that has turned from God. The government is as evil as it's ever been. All kinds of false religions, and pressuring people of God to compromise and run it into hiding, even actively trying to arrest them and kill them. And there's one man standing on Mount Carmel. 850 prophets of Baal and Asherah against one man of God. And fearlessly, just stares down 850 to 1. There's King Ahab. There's his henchmen ready to kill Elijah as soon as this day is done. And without flinching, Elijah calls fire down from heaven. And right on cue, the fire falls. And the entire nation, all the leaders start crying out, "The Lord God, He is God." And through the centuries, that enormous victory, rarely have the forces of darkness been lured out of their abysses and been so utterly, completely defeated in one day. And I'm thinking to myself, God, that's in the world in which I live, where there's so much evil, so much sin, so much wickedness today. God, I want to be an Elijah for you. If I'm the only one where you place me, the only one left standing saying, but God says, then let that be me. And so I'm turning, that story is found in 1 Kings chapter 18, so I'm turning to 1 Kings 18, but as I'm literally, has God ever interrupted one of your quiet times before? Like you started out thinking you're going to do one thing, and then God interrupted, hijacked it, and said, I want to upgrade what you planning on doing today. That's what God did with me that day. I've got my Bible open, I'm turning to 1 Kings 18, so I can read about Elijah on Mount Carmel. And as I'm turning there, I literally felt like God said, well, if you want to know how to become an Elijah, don't go to 1 Kings 18, go to 1 Kings 17. Because he wasn't the Elijah that you know of on Mount Carmel in chapter 17. That's where I made him one. And if you want me to make you a mighty man or woman of God, then I want you to see what God did with Elijah. So what we're going to do is we're going to walk through this process, what God actually did, to take a servant of his from where he was at the time to where God wanted him to be. Can I just say this to you? I don't think this is news to you. Certainly in America and around the world today, the level of evil, the level of opposition to Christianity, the turning away of so many that at one day were in the church or at least raised around the church, calls for a higher level of ministry and spiritual leadership than we have given the world to this point. More of the same will not bring revival. We need something different, something more. And that means every servant of God has got to stand before God and say, God, and what would it look like for you to take my ministry, my service, to a place it's never been before? Billy Graham had his funeral last week. My parents were invited to that funeral. They were there. 2,300 people. You had to have a very elaborate invitation to get to that funeral. All kinds of barcodes, and every 2,300 seats were all assigned. And a lot of people, maybe you watched it online, but people are thinking, well, Billy Graham is gone. You know, how do you replace someone like that? Well, I don't know that you replace someone identically to Billy Graham. He was God's man for his day. For our day, who is God prepared to raise up? And would you be willing for God to do in you whatever was required for you to be the man or woman that he wants you to be right now? But I can tell you one thing, God doesn't want you just to be the same person you've been. I can tell you that with absolute confidence. There's not a person in this room who does not need to grow and go to a deeper place. None of us. And God reminded me of that very powerfully. And so watch, here's just one other thing, and then we're just going to jump into this, and we'll just kind of, while I'm with you, we're just going to journey with Elijah here and see what God does. But one other thing I want you just to notice at the outset, and that is, with God, as you read the Bible, what you're going to notice is what God does. God will speak, God will give assignments, He'll send a word. God is always working out His purposes. And so when you read the Bible, you'll often see that God does something. But this is what you need to be reminded of. What God does is very important. But how God does things is equally as important. You see, you can actually do the right thing and do it the wrong way. I've seen that many, many times. Very sincere, young pastor goes to his first church, all on fire. He knows the church needs to be revived. The church needs to start growing. It needs to reach out. So what does he do? The first 2 weeks, starts making major changes to get this church the way it ought to be. And within a month, he's been ushered to the door and he's fired. And this bewildered young enthusiast says, well, I don't know what happened. This is what, I know God wanted these things to happen. But why am I unemployed now? Well, Yeah, he did want those things to happen. But did you ever ask him how he wanted those things to happen? And not only how God does things is important, but when God does things. You can do the right thing, but do it too late. Have you ever been guilty of that? By the time you got around to doing what you knew God wanted you to do, the time was past. Or you can do the right thing too soon, like the young preacher who comes in and he doesn't have any credibility yet, and he's starting to make changes like he's been a 10-year veteran in that church. It's too soon. And so with God, if you're going to really be effective as a servant of God, you need to understand what God is doing, but you also need to understand how he does things, because God's ways are not our ways. And the problem with the church today is we keep trying to do God's work the world's way. You've got to do God's work God's way. And you've got to do God's work in God's timing. And God's timing oftentimes is not as quick as we would like it to be. My parents used to do a marriage conference, and my dad at a certain point would typically say, on all the times of walking by faith, he would say, God was never late. God was never late to provide what we needed. And my mother would usually chime in, and he was rarely early. Meaning, so many times it was the last moment God's provision would come. Rarely did God provide months ahead of time. It was when you needed it. And there was something about the way of God that said, I will provide, but in my timing, not yours. I'll tell you what, that can drive you crazy, can't it? Yeah. Trying to walk by faith, but God doesn't put everything in place until the last minute. Because if you had everything in place, you wouldn't need faith anymore, would you? And without faith, it's impossible to please God. So God's always working his purposes in such a way that you have to have faith. So as we go through looking at Elijah, and we'll just kind of get started tonight, but watch how God does things. Because how God does things, when God does things, is crucial. So 1 Kings 17 verse 1 says, Now Elijah, the Tishbite. By the way, what is a Tishbite? It sounds like an insect attack, doesn't it? Suffering from a Tishbite. It needs some ointment or something. Of course, Tish means he's from the village of Tishba. And it says he's from the settlers of Gilead. Now, if you have a Bible with you, and you were to look in the Bible maps at the back of your Bible, you probably are not going to find Tishba. Now, Elijah is arguably the greatest prophet in the Old Testament. But you can't even put his hometown on the map because it's so insignificant. In fact, when you go to Gilead, you can't even find Tishba anywhere in Gilead. Archaeologists have found a Tishba in Naphtali, which is like 12 miles north of Gilead, but they've never found one in Gilead. And so what this is just saying is, it doesn't really matter where you come from. You can come from the most insignificant place, like a Tishba, matters not at all to God. Where you come from doesn't matter. Where God's taking you means everything. It's where you're going that matters. My dad is the greatest man of God that I've known. He was born in Williams Lake, Canada. My dad always says, not in the lake, but in the city of Williams Lake. Does anyone know where Williams Lake is? Does anyone know? It's in British Columbia. It's in Western Canada. No one's heard of it. No, you wouldn't have no reason to. But it is interesting because here's this little hick town in the rural parts of Western Canada. But I stood in the White House with my dad as he spoke to the President of the United States and spoke to national leaders and religious leaders. I'm in the East Room of the White House, and I'm sitting there watching, and my dad's a Canadian, and he's addressing the President of the United States and all the national leaders. I've seen him speak he's spoken several times in the United Nations. He spoke at the Pentagon. And I'm thinking to myself, and every time I do that, I say, Dad, what's it like for a Canadian from nowhere to be invited to the White House? And he just always shakes his head and says, only God, only God. But you know, I hear people all the time come up to me and say, well, Richard, you know, I'm not I just pastor a small church, you know, or I've never I've never gotten a seminary degree, or I don't have much. We just have this way of minimizing who we are because where we came from, or what we don't have, or what we didn't study. But the greatest prophet, perhaps in the Bible, came from a place you can't even put on a map today. Archaeologists have searched for his hometown. They can't even find it because it's so insignificant. I love that. Right off the bat. This is the guy who's going to do one of the most heroic, epic things in the Bible in chapter 18. And he's from a place no one can even place on a map. It's so insignificant. You know what? What that says to me is, do like Paul. Forget what lies behind. There's maybe a lot of stuff in your past that's insignificant or even painful. But that's not what should be determining you. Tishba did not determine what Elijah became. God determined that. And it will be God that determines what happens in your life and ministry, not your upbringing, not your parents. They impacted who you are, but they don't determine that. God will determine that if you'll let him. He's a Tishbite. And he said to Ahab, "As the Lord God of Israel lives." Which is interesting, isn't it? But why would he start out saying that? As the Lord God of Israel lives. In fact, he'll say that several times if you read through Elijah's life. Why does he begin with the statement like that? So I think what he's saying is, the reason I'm here today is because the Lord God of Israel lives. Everything I do is not because I have a doctrine of God. Not because I have a belief system, a worldview about the God of Israel. It's because he is alive. He's real. That's why I do everything I do in ministry, is because my God lives. He's real. And so he begins with that, and he says, "In whose presence I stand." Now, if you read this whole verse, what you'll find is the only credential that Elijah gives. He doesn't even mention he's from Tishba. The writer tells us that. But the only credential that Elijah actually, now here he is, he's presenting himself to the king, the most powerful leader in his country, and the only credential is not what his degrees are. He doesn't say, "I pastor one of the largest churches in Israel." He doesn't say, "I've written 3 books. One of them was on the New York Times best-selling list." He doesn't say any of that, right? What's the only credential he gives? I stand in God's presence. Now, if you stand in God's presence, what does that mean that you know? You know what's on the heart and the mind of God. As God's working out his purposes, you're right there in his presence to understand the activity of God, the Word of God. Can I just tell you this? The only thing that Elijah, his only credential was, I've been in God's presence. And that was enough for him to become the greatest prophet in the Bible. Do any of us have access to that same presence? You know, it doesn't matter whether you can read Greek or Hebrew. It doesn't matter if you've got 3 or 4 seminary degrees. Every one of us has exactly the same opportunity to enter into the presence of God. And when you've been in the presence of God, you've got authority to speak to kings. There's no government leader, there's no powerful person on the planet who will not have to take into account what you say when you've just come from the presence of God. I can tell you, I feel, at one point I had 3 teenage children. And now and then my children would actually come and ask me my opinion. I wasn't sure if they were just doing that to humor me or if they really wanted to know. But they would come and they would say, "Dad, I'm trying to decide what university to go to. I'm trying to decide what degree to major in," or, you know, various issues like that. And you know what? I have lots of regrets about my parenting. And one of the regrets is, too often when my kids ask me my opinion or for counsel, that's what I gave them. Because I always had an opinion for my kids. Even when they didn't ask me, I had an opinion for them. And so they would say, "Dad, what do you think?" And I would just tell them what I thought. And you know, this is what I wish I had done more of. I did it sometimes, but not nearly enough. When my son came and said, "Dad, I'm trying to decide what to major in college, what direction my life should go, what I should do with my life," I wish I had said, "Son, you know I love you. There's no man on this planet who loves you more than I do. And you know I want what's best for you. So I've got lots of opinions. But this is just too important for me just to tell you the first thing off the top of my head. So listen, would you just give me 2 or 3 days to take this to God? And just go into God's presence and just listen to what I sense God has in His heart for you. Now that doesn't that doesn't substitute for Him going and seeking from God. But I said, I know God wants to tell you directly, but before I give you any counsel, I want to go into God's presence myself, lay this matter before Him, and listen to what God says to me. Can you imagine coming back 3 days later to your child and saying, remember that really important question you asked me 3 days ago? I've been drawn into God's presence every day just asking Him, because son, this is just too important to get this one wrong. And so I dare not give you my opinion until I've been in God's presence and listened to what He had to say. There's an authority that comes when you've been in God's presence. People listen, because you know what? When you hear what God says and you declare that, you share that, it's amazing how God blesses His word and His purpose. Now, He's not obligated to bless your opinion. And that can get kind of frustrating sometimes, but because I'm really enamored with some of my opinions. I think they're pretty good, but they don't hold a candle to God. And too many times I've been too quick just to pop off what came to mind, because I felt like there was always an urgency. If he wants to hear, I want to tell him. Elijah said, I've just been in God's presence, so you'll want to hear what I have to say. And you can speak that with confidence, right? There have been times when I've been a little tentative about my own opinion, but when I know what God has to say, you can proclaim that with confidence every solitary time. Did you notice, by the way, who Elijah's congregation is? Some of you may have a difficult congregation. Do you think yours was as tough as Elijah's? Who's his congregation made up of? Like perhaps the most wicked king, at least at that point, ever to rule Israel. In fact, if you look down in the previous chapter, it says in verse 33, Ahab did more to anger the Lord God of Israel than all the kings of Israel who were before him. Now think about that. No government leader had ever made God as angry as Ahab did. Now how would you like to have that for your congregation? And he's got henchmen there. His wife, by the way, who's Ahab married to? Jezebel. And the Bible says that she was actually hunting down. Her henchmen were hunting down people like Elijah and putting them to death. So as far as we know, now God may have given Elijah other assignments, but the first assignment that we see Elijah being given is, go tell the most evil man in this land news that's going to make him really angry. And because what does Elijah tell him? He says, there will be no dew, there will be no rain on the land, but at my word. Now why, of course, you know some of the history of this. Why would God, of all the things He could have told Ahab, why does He say no more rain?
Baal was God of rain.
God, yeah, because they have forsaken the true God to worship Baal, the god of the storm, the god of rain, and other fertility gods. And so now, of course, God promised to give them rain. God said, I'll give you what you need, but God is a holy God. God said, if I'm going to answer your prayers, you're going to have to be holy as I am holy. Well, Baal had no such qualms. Baal just said, hey, cheat people in business, cheat on your spouse if you want to. I don't care. Lie all you want, cheat all you want. Just give me what I want, and I'll give you what you want. That's kind of a worldly type religion at its finest. And so the Israelites have turned from worshiping the holy God to worshiping the God of rain. So what does God do? He declares war on His people's idols. And if there's just one thing I can just assure you of, is God hates your idols. He hates your idols. And if He hasn't yet, He will declare war on your idols. He will expose them. He will take away their power, and He will show you the emptiness of loving those more than loving Him. And so Elijah is told, go tell the most evil man ever to rule this nation news that's going to make him really upset. Because, of course, if there's no rain, then the farmers aren't going to have any crops, and then they're not going to pay any taxes, and the king will have no money to pay his soldiers to live a luxurious lifestyle. And so it's awful news for Ahab. And can you imagine your first assignment? I don't know if you've ever had, has God ever given you a burden, a truth? Maybe you're leading a Bible study, you're just sharing something. I remember when I was a pastor of my first church, I had just gotten out of seminary. I'm going to a dysfunctional, broken church, and I'm someone who likes for people to like me. And so I'm thinking, well, what should I've never preached a sermon series before. I had preached before, but never, I thought I'm going to start out with a series on Sunday mornings. What series can I do that will make people, lift them up? They've been through a lot of hard times, and that they'll like me as their pastor, and we'll become friends. And so I finally thought, I'll preach on the Sermon on the Mount. I mean, Matthew 5, 6, 7, how can you go wrong with that? It starts out, blessed are you. Who doesn't want to be blessed? That'll be great. But I was an inexperienced preacher, and the Beatitudes only go on for a few verses, and then Jesus starts to meddle, and he actually doesn't get all that far into that first chapter when he actually starts saying what he thinks about things like divorce. And I promised my people that I would preach every verse in the Sermon on the Mount. I should have read every verse first before I made that promise. I said, we won't leave one verse out. You will have an exhaustive coverage of the Sermon on the Mount when we're done this series. And so now I'm starting to look ahead. Well, what's coming up here? What will I be preaching on? And I'm like, oh my word. He says some pretty hard things here. Now, Jesus is very loving, but he doesn't, he doesn't avoid things. And my problem is, and I remember in this particular case, there was some things about divorce. Jesus, if you're not careful, can offend people. And so I'm just new to this church. This is I've just gotten there. But I know at least 3 prominent women in that church who are all divorced. Now, I think in most cases, their husband had left them, cheated on them, divorce, but nonetheless they're divorced. And so I'm literally getting scared that I don't want to lose anybody this early in my ministry. But I've got to at least just say what Jesus said. I've got to at least present that. I've got to read those verses. So I actually started to delay. I started going into more detail. And we're going to do a little excursus for the next week or two on this Greek word, because I'm trying to avoid getting to these troublesome verses later on in the chapter. But finally, I couldn't avoid it anymore. And so we get to that day. And I had the longest preamble. I said, now folks, I just want you to understand right at the beginning here, I did not write this. I'm only reporting it. So if you don't like what it says, take it up with the author. All I'm doing is just telling you what he said. And I'm going all the way around the barn trying not to offend anybody, just as gently as I can to just sort of, present what Jesus said. And I get to this certain point, and 2 of those divorced women get up and they leave the building. They walk out. My worst fears are happening. And I remember just being shaken. Now, I've had other experiences where people walked out on me when I was preaching, so now I'm kind of experienced at that. But at that time, I was not very experienced, and it shook me. Here I am, I've only been there just a couple of months, and I've got people walking out of my sermons. And I tried to be as kind and gracious and nice and understanding as I could be. And as far as I know, I've just lost 2 tithing members of the church walking out. And I'll just tell you this, in that moment, I had to decide, was I going to be true to what God says, even if it scared me to death? Or would I start compromising and saying, well, let me change this. Let me not say quite the way Jesus said it. And I just had to decide, you know what? I want to be gracious. I want to be loving. I want to be kind. Certainly don't want to be harsh. But I got to tell the truth. I got to tell the truth. Now, fortunately, those women were gracious as well. I tracked them both down afterward, and they said, Richard, everything you said is right. They said, I know that's what the Bible says. They said, it just still hurts, though. And I said, well, I can understand that. I said, just pray for me. I always have the courage to preach the truth in love. But always tell you the truth. You deserve that from your pastor. Well, Elijah faces a huge moment of truth right here. Am I going to tell the truth that would probably get me killed, or do I water it down just a little bit? Well, we'll just point one last thing here, and then we'll stop for the night. But do you notice what he said? What do you think of his sermon, by the way? I'm going to do a seminar one day and just public speaking, which is kind of putting a speaker on the spot even to do that. But what do you think of his sermon? Not a lot of... Pretty short, wasn't it? Have you noticed some of the most powerful speeches in history have been relatively brief? You know what we're in danger of sometimes as preachers or teachers? Like, we've got a truth from God that will rock people, but we bury that truth with a bunch of our opinion and commentary. And have you ever heard of someone preach, you think, wow, this is the most powerful thing I've ever heard. And then about 20 minutes goes by and it's like, have an altar call. Like, just have people start praying. Like, this is, the glory is falling. But then they go on about 40, 50 more minutes. Now, okay, that's what God says. Now, let me tell you what I think about what God said. And before you know it, it's like the moment is gone. Sometimes less is more. Elijah just puts the truth out, lets it stand on its own, and it's devastating. I mean, I don't know the last time you preached or led a Bible study and it changed weather patterns, but I mean, the weather changes after this sermon. It's pretty powerful. Now, the last thing I'll just say, and we'll stop, is what do you think of Elijah's obedience at this point? How does he do? What kind of grade would you give him? Not bad, eh? A+, yeah. Like, so if you know you're going to die, you're going to be killed for doing what God just told you to do, and so but you obey anyway. You just fearlessly walk into the most evil king ever to rule the country, who's killed a bunch of your colleagues already, and you don't bat an eye, you don't compromise, you don't water it down, you just tell them the truth just like God gave it to you. All that happens in verse 1. So if you did that, what would you think you would read in verse 2? What should verse 2 say? Verse 2 should say, and then God said, well done, good and faithful servant. You were faithful, you're obedient. Now's the time of blessing. Now I've got this nice little chateau up in the hills in Judea you might want to go to and spend a little time. There's a Christian publisher that wants to have you write a book with them, and there's some pastors' conferences that you're going to be asked to speak in, and Elijah will be swept up writing a book about his best sermons he ever preached, and he'd become a Christian celebrity. But that's not what happens, right? What happens in verse 2? God says, run for your life. Run for your life, and head into the desert, head into the wilderness. We'll talk about the wilderness tomorrow, but one of the most troubling things that I've dealt with people in ministry is people who did everything they thought God told them to do, and they ended up in a wilderness. Ahab is still in the palace. It's the righteous person who's in the wilderness now. Is it possible that you could be doing everything God told you and you find yourself in a barren, desolate wilderness one day? Is it fair for God to treat His finest servants that way? I've known pastors, I've known ministers who took a stand for what was right and true, and they got fired. They weren't even given severance pay, just told, get out of the parsonage, you're done. And they had done nothing wrong. I had a good friend who had taken a little country church and grown it so much, they baptized more people than they had baptized in any one year in over 100 years. They went from 1 service to 3 services. In a town of 1,100 people, he brought me in to have a men's wild game supper one night. And he had 2,000 men show up for an outreach event when the entire town only had 1,100 people. And 2 weeks later, he was fired. No immorality, nothing wrong, nothing illegal. They just thought it was best if he moved on and they got someone else. And that man called me and said, Richard, I did everything God told me to do. Now I'm unemployed. Why would God let me go through that? Well, we'll look at that tomorrow. But Can I just encourage you with that? I hear, it's rare, and I speak around the world to ministers' meetings like this. It's almost never am I in a meeting like this where someone does not come to me and say, Richard, I'm in a wilderness right now. I'm dry. I don't have a passion for the future anymore. I don't know what I'm doing. I don't have the same joy in ministry that I used to have, not having the same victory. I just feel like I'm in a wilderness right now, and I don't know how I got there. Well, we immediately beat ourselves up and say, what did I do wrong? Is there some unconfessed sin, or is God just not fair? Well, yeah, you have to kind of see how God handles Elijah to understand. There's more than one way to get in the wilderness. We'll see that tomorrow. But let me pray with you, and I'll be done. Lord, thank you for each person who is here. I know you love them. I know you've called them. I know you have amazing things that you could do through every person in this room. God, I just confess for myself, there are days, there are weeks, there are stretches in my life where I'm not growing like I should. I'm preaching the same way I have for years. I'm praying the same way I have for years. I'm witnessing the way I have for years. And Lord, I just know in my spirit that you want more from me. There could be more from me. And so God, I pray that you would just create within every one of us a holy hunger for more. As wonderful as it's been to serve you so far, God, if you've got more for us, we want it. Because if we don't get it, people will suffer. People that we love the most may be the ones who suffer the most. Because our prayers for them will not be the caliber of prayers they could have been. The Christian example and witness, the preaching, the teaching may not be what it might have been had we been everything that you intended for us to be. So God, I just pray that even in this conference, will you give us rest, give us restoration. Lord, for those who might be in something of a wilderness right now, will you give clarity? Will you spring up within them that well of living water and let them know that you reside within them, and wherever you are is living water. May we drink fully of that water while we're here and receive from you everything we need so that when we leave this place, our cup is full. For Lord, we know we can't give to others what we don't have ourselves. So fill up our cup so we've got lots to give everyone that we touch and minister to. And I'd pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.